Many people have a bucket list of places they would like to visit one day. My husband and I had the Outer or Western Isles on this list, but sadly we were not both able to realize this before he died. We had been on a very successful Mediterranean cruise a couple of years previously under the auspices of Noble Caledonia, and had appreciated the care of passengers and the relaxed house party atmosphere which was encouraged. Not long after my husband's death, I noticed a cruise in the many brochures regularly received, which took one to the Western Isles, including the very remote ones, and also had the attraction of starting and finishing in Oban, so I booked it. Garaging the car in Oban, I found I was by no means the only passenger doing the same, and found myself making friends already in the taxi provided to take us to the quay. Settling in involved the usual safety drill. In each cabin, there were 2 life jackets, one vast one for abandoning ship, and a smaller one, which was in regular use for boarding a Zodiac to go ashore. The Hebridean Sky set sail before dinner and headed south to anchor off Colonsay for the night. That was the first occasion on which I enjoyed looking out before turning in to see little lights on the island and shining on the water. On board a Zodiac in the morning, and the pleasure of a good brisk walk of 2 to 3 miles to the grounds of Colonsay House. This building was erected on the site of a medieval monastery, Killoran Abbey, in 1722, and later received many additions. The gardens are rambling and spectacular, but I was keen to see the Holy Well, the Toba Oran, and the ancient cross beside it. The cross dates from the 8th or 9th century and was brought at some time from a ruined village nearby. This was our first introduction to the rich heritage of early Celtic Christian relics in these islands, and St. Oran was our first unfamiliar saint. A smart return walk to the landing stage did allow time for the purchase of some local honey, which had been recommended. After lunch on board, we donned Wellingtons for a wet landing on Oronsay, and a walk of about a mile to the well-preserved ruins of a 14th century Augustinian priory with a miniature cloister. Outside was an ancient cross. One building contained a large collection of carved gravestones. One of the great advantages of a cruise which tours in a particular area instead of going on a voyage is that if the forecast in one area turns out bad, an alternative destination can be chosen. There were 1 or 2 changes in our itinerary for this reason, which meant that sometimes a visit did not occur, but instead we went somewhere else. And in that way, we were almost always in good weather. The next morning, we found we'd arrived near the Shant Islands on a fine morning, instead of being unable to land on Mingoulay and Pabay as planned. The Shants are privately owned by the Nicholson family. Purchased by Nigel, they were passed on to his son Adam as a 21st birthday present, and Adam wrote the attractive book Sea Room about them. They are now the property of his son. There are 3 islands. Some of the Zodiacs took people to look for birds, seals, and dolphins. It was not necessary to go far for the latter, for as soon as they realized that there was some kind of boat activity, we were surrounded by dolphins. There must have been almost 50, but it was impossible to count. In the afternoon, we were at sea with interesting talks on offer, on our way to St Kilda, usually a high spot in any Hebridean cruise. It was wonderful to wake up in the morning and there it was. To my great delight, weather conditions were favourable for making a landing, something which cannot be guaranteed. I joined a group which was making a tour of the village with a lecturer. We used things called quiet vox, which meant you could switch on to hear what was being said and could still hear it quite far away. There is an old free church in the village, which smells just like country churches in Scotland always used to, of damp and old Bibles. Next door was a little schoolroom with desks and slates. The manse houses the National Trust staff and a small shop which we all patronised. Moving along the street towards the cemetery, I broke away from the group and continued on, looking into the ruined roofless houses. In one, there was a sudden movement, and here was a St Kilda wren, Troglodytes hirtensis, having a good look at me. It hopped across to another perch and looked again, and then went off. I wondered if I should have bowed. Going through the village, we also saw a wheatear, a snipe, and some meadow pipits, so it is not all seabirds. We only had the morning on the island. Even getting back on board, there was much more movement in the water, and we were hauled on board. They say that St Kilda was not a real saint. The main island is called Herta, and further on there is Borroway, which we passed in the afternoon. On Herta, there are vestigial remains of a chapel dedicated to St Columba near the village, and another further away to St Brianon. In the afternoon, we passed the spectacular cliffs of Stack Lee, which is a gannetry, and went on our way past the Flannan Islands, which now has an automatic lighthouse, but once it was manned by 3 keepers. During a fierce storm, all 3 keepers disappeared, and no bodies were ever recovered. The lighthouse had clearly been abandoned in a hurry, and it's presumed that 2 men went out to secure equipment on the landing stage. The third saw worse weather coming and went out to warn them, and all were swept away by a freak wave. Once again, we altered our course for reasons of weather, and the tour leaders had to find somewhere for us to go in the morning. They decided to take us to an uninhabited island at the mouth of Loch Broom called Isle Martin. The island is community owned, and we had to get permission to visit. There are several habitable buildings, but no one lives there permanently. The arrangement having been made at the last minute, we presumed that the assurance of coffee and cake provided by local ladies would entail midnight baking, and therefore, hungry or not, we must all eat a cake. They were very good. It was a perfect sunny morning. The island had everything: a ruined village, an old graveyard with crosses and carved stones, shoreline walks, and peaceful coves. In the afternoon, we reached Ullapool. It was a long time since I'd been there, and I saw many changes, mainly housing where there had been none. One advantage was an excellent bookshop. The following morning, we moored alongside in Stornoway. Buses conveyed us to 3 sites of great interest and importance. The standing stones of Callanish are one of Scotland's major monuments. These monoliths are placed on top of a hill from which 2 other henges can be seen in the distance. The stones date from 3000 BC and are believed to be connected with moon-based worship. From there, we moved on to something very different: the Broch of Duncarloway. We crept under a low entrance to reach the main courtyard, from which we could see the internal galleries and stairs in the walls. Our final call was at Girranan Black House Village, where some of the houses had been turned into holiday accommodation, but one was kept as it had originally been, rather packed with furniture and belongings, and a peat fire burning. In one, there was a weaver at work on a length of tweed. In the afternoon, there was a choice of things to do in Stornoway, and many people took their maps and went for a walk in the town, mostly making their way up to Lewes Castle and its grounds. The castle contains a fine modern museum, where we were able to see some of the Lewes chessmen on loan from the British Museum. The next morning, we arrived at North Rona, an island 65 kilometers north of Lewes, and truly an island on the edge of the world. This was the sort of place which attracted early Celtic saints, and St Ronan was believed to have been an early inhabitant. It has cliffs and seabirds, but is green and apparently fertile, with sheep grazing there during the summer. It had been hoped to make rock landings from the Zodiacs, but the scout boat reported slippery intertidal rocks and rising swell, and it was considered too dangerous. However, we were able to make a slow circumnavigation with a commentary and really saw most of it. Inhabited until the 18th century, there are no habitable buildings left except a small hut used by ornithologists. There are, however, many remains of buildings, including the ruin of a chapel. We also sailed past Sulaskier, another gannetry. Both islands are national nature reserves, but the latter is the least visited. In the afternoon, we moored off Kinloch Burvey, and there were visits to the fish market and a walk round a nearby loch. We arrived very early the next morning at Canna, went ashore promptly to be greeted by National Trust Scotland staff, and divided into groups to be taken around. I loved this island and could have spent a long time here. My group was taken inland through a wood to the site of an old religious foundation where there had been the remains of a chapel. Situated in the middle of good farming land, there was not much to be seen except the remains of a fine freestanding cross, of which only the shaft and one arm remained. However, one could clearly see a Virgin and Child with Magi, as well as a Pictish rider on a little stocky horse. At the foot of the cross was a sort of bowl-shaped stone with a large round stone sitting in it. To my great interest, this was a prayer stone, something quite rare, and only two are known in Scotland, the other having been found on the Shants, and you can see Adam Nicholson's book for that. These stones were carried around by monks and usually come from a totally different area from where they were found. They look like a large stone hot cross bun with an incised cross on one side. From there, we walked across the hillside, through a wood, and past Canna House, which is not open at present, but which houses the amazing collection of Gaelic literature collected by John Lorne Campbell, who gave Canna to the National Trust for Scotland. Further away from the village, near the coast, there is the ruin of a nunnery, which is in the process of being excavated, and where there are many cross fragments. The village has a post office and a cafe, where we enjoyed hot chocolate on a rather overcast and chilly morning. During lunch, we sailed to Loch Scavaig off Skye. The idea was to land and walk to Loch Carrusk, but the weather took a turn for the worse. The Hebridean Princess was already there, the swell increased, and the ship began to drag her anchor. It was a typical bad Skye day. The clouds were down, sitting on the tops of the mountains. So we sailed away to Loch Nevis and anchored off Inveree on an evening of glassy calm and utter beauty. We once stayed in Inveree some years ago, and again there were changes, not least in the position of the pier, which had been relocated. There were several very modern houses built near the village. Some people went ashore for a rather damp walk and were not pleased to find the pub shut. We lay off for the night and moved on to Iona in the early hours. Our last day was perfect. Blue skies, blue seas, and visibility forever. Landing quite early on Iona so that we could get the advantage of being ahead of the first ferry from Mull, some of us headed off for walks. I went off up to the north to look for a memorial seat which had been placed there by the family of a great friend of my husband's. It took a little finding, but was in a lovely position overlooking the sea, and it was a blessed place to spend a little peaceful time by oneself. Coming back towards the village, I visited the abbey and its very good museum, which was new since my last visit. However, the crowds had arrived, and I am not sure what the Celtic saints, with their love of solitude, would have made of it. Back on board, we moored off Staffa, and I enjoyed my lunch out on the aft deck, looking back towards Iona, out towards the Treshnish Islands, then the opposite direction across to Mull. There were trips on the Zodiacs to Staffa, where there is now a small landing stage in the rocks. Mendelssohn was played on the address system all afternoon. On a calm evening, we sailed round the north of Mull, past Ardnamurchan, and anchored for the night off Oban. In the morning, we disembarked and headed for home.